un programme pour sauvegarder le patrimoine en situation d'urgence. Faire partie du Scale-up programme nous a permis de réaliser à quel point nous agissons pour la paix.
Empatia is a project that promotes the use of AI to solve public issues such as health, development, or climate change.
The purpose of the initiative is to create collaboration on environmental issues across the India-Pakistan border on issues like air pollution, water usage, and sustainable agriculture.
The Scale-up program is an accelerator of global governance solutions. We aim to help project teams be better equipped to influence and challenge governance, and ultimately help them amplify their impact and their reach.
Being recognised for the work we were trying to do to make change globally out of Africa and out of the global south was part of what the Scale Up Award meant for us.
We've had a phenomenal year throughout the SCUP program, and I think the secret to kind of growing and scaling impact is collaboration.
To both project leaders and to experts, we ask them, please join us and get involved with the Scale program.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I think you need to put your earpiece on because of the ambient noise.
Priyanka.
If you can put your earpiece on, because otherwise you won't hear. And we won't hear you if you ask questions. Okay, so let's start. So talking about mediation today, when the language of force seems to be drowning out, just a bit like the noise around us, drowning out any voice of peace, you may think that we're going to make an interplanetary trip during those 45 minutes. Discussing a world that no longer exists. Actually, on our panel, we have Hassan Salameh, who wrote a great book, La Tentation de Mars, The Temptation of Mars, the God of War, where he explains in greater detail that movement of the world toward a world where the language of force is the only language that can be understood. And so talking about mediation looks a bit like a Don Quixote attempt. But that's what we're going to do. And I think actually that when you look under the surface, we see that on the one hand, between states, the relations have never been so bad. And there is, for a variety of reasons that we can discuss, states today are not much inclined to negotiation. They want to assert their power, and it's the balance of power that matters to most of them. On the other hand, you see that there are some efforts at a different level, most of the time at a non-state level, that sometimes produce results. They produce results which may not always be real mediation, but which alleviate the suffering of the people. We lower our ambition. Sometimes it's about humanitarian ceasefires, humanitarian distribution of food. It's a range of things that do not address the fundamental political issues for which states are actually at each other's throats. But there are such efforts. And to start us off, I would like to kick us off, I would want to start with Maria Fernanda Espinosa. You know how much she represents. I mean, she has a very distinguished career. She was the 73rd President of the UN General Assembly. She is, if I may say, an activist, pushing for good causes. So you have watched the UN, but you also watched civil society. And you are a fighter for inclusion. And we know that top-down mediation usually don't work, or if they work, they fail if there is not the broader support of the population once they have achieved any kind of agreement. So if you could share a bit of your experience on that, I think we will be very interested.
Well, thank you very much, Jean-Marie. First of all, I need to get used to this system. You know, it's very strange that you can hear yourself in in a loudspeaker sort of. But I think that we can all get used to this technology. So thank you again, Jean-Marie, for bringing to the conversation something that is absolutely critical, which is mediation. And I would say that the United Nations has a critical role to play in something that is bigger than mediation, which is preventive diplomacy. And I'm afraid that the world we live in today, war, confrontation, and violence has replaced diplomacy and has replaced dialogue and the possibility to process dissent using the United Nations home, which is a real pity. It doesn't mean that we cannot the UN cannot rethink and reinvent itself so we can play again the role. And I'm just thinking about success stories in past history. And let's recall the very harsh moments of the Cold War. And if you recall, there was this the red line or the red telephone for the two powers to talk to each other on very difficult situations and circumstances. And the truth is that the red line or the red telephone at the time was in a way a metaphor for the United Nations. The United Nations was an enabler, for two opponents to talk to each other on the difficult and harsh situations. And I don't think the UN should abandon that role, but should regain the role, should focus more on prevention and preventive diplomacy. We need to relaunch that concept. And I think we need to strongly reject that violence and war could be the by default solution. We live a very a multipolar world crossed by different multiple and compounded crises. We're living a difficult world where I think the role of the United Nations is more needed than ever. As former Minister of Defense of Ecuador, of my country, I can tell you I follow, and as Foreign Minister, I followed very, very closely the example of the peace process and the peace agreement in Colombia. If you want, Jean-Marie, I can speak a little more about that, or are we going to have a second round, or you want me to briefly tackle that? I'm under your guidance as a moderator.
We will have a second round, but if you want to talk now about Colombia, that's very interesting.
Very, very briefly, and again, what was the role of the UN? It was a witness, an enabling witness of the peace talks under a very strong leadership of President Santos. But there was a secret in the negotiation tables, and the secret was the presence of women as mediators, as peacemakers. If you look at the composition of this very panel of highly qualified, tremendously experienced men, that's how the world looks like today. You know, 3 incredible men, but just me here, sitting here. This should not be, you know, the rule when mediation processes take place. In the case of Colombia, there were many women that were involved in both sides, including on the observers and accompanying force presence of the United Nations. And today, in this, you know, peace building implementation of the peace agreement, which has been not without challenges, again, you see the role of women in making sure that the peace agreements are implemented. So the issue of the voices and the role of women in peacemaking is extremely, extremely important. Leadership, ownership of people on the ground as well. And again, a role that we need to advocate for and to ask for, the UN being this bridge builder, this space and place for good diplomacy and for prevention. So once again, to advocate for strong, good preventive diplomacy. We need to revitalize the role of the UN as the center for preventive diplomacy.
Thank you very much. And we see that preventive diplomacy makes a lot of sense, not only because conflict takes such a horrible toll on human lives, but we see today that conflicts are harder and harder to end. And so there's a much better chance if you start early rather than once it's already started. And on that note, I'm going to turn to Daniel Levy. Daniel, you were a member of the Israeli negotiating team at a time when Israel was interested in negotiation. And today we see the path to negotiation as essentially blocked. But you've continued to observe as an independent observer and actor the Middle East situation. And we see the UN is also invisible at the moment on the Middle East, except on humanitarian issues. What can be done? We see independent initiatives, but which are not, like we heard Prime Minister Olmert and Nasser al-Kidwa earlier today. But how can sort of non-state actors articulate their actions so that in the end they have an impact for peace? And what is the space for mediation today?
Does this work?
Yes.
Great. I'm getting a flashback to the one and only silent disco I ever attended in my life. I promise not to sing if you promise not to dance. And what I'm going to be talking about, there's nothing to sing or dance about. Look, there's no prospect for mediation and negotiation to be successful if the conditions are so stacked against it. And that's where we are, and sadly, that's where we have been in what is going on now for more than a year. Partly, the initial efforts were to decontextualize, as if October 7th was an abnormal day, which it was, and violations of international law happened extensively on that day, but as if it came against the backdrop, which doesn't justify anything, but against the backdrop of October 6th and the decades preceding it being normal. They certainly weren't normal for Palestinians, living under the permanent denial of their rights. When you decontextualize, you're already setting off on the wrong foot. What has happened subsequently, I would say, is perhaps a good, I don't know, a good place to interrogate what can and can't be done under certain circumstances. And I think there were options. One option was to say Israel is clearly bent on doing some things which are going to have very immediate, dramatic consequences for Palestinians, which they have had, and it only gets worse, by the way. But is there a way of offering Israel something else? And I think there was a thought that you could go down that path, really not paying attention to just how easy you had made Israel's situation already. So the main carrot on the table was Saudi normalization, I think. This was the attempt to deploy something. But the lesson Israel had learnt from the existing normalization accords was you don't have to pay any price in what you are doing to the Palestinians in order to have that. And they were quite dismissive of that effort. Nevertheless, it continued to be pursued. A second option, which exists in more than theory, is to say, if you are going, Israel, to continue to violate international law every day, if you are going to be in violation of International Court of Justice, urgent measures in a genocide case, if you are going to end up in a place where your leadership has request warrants, a request for warrants, rather, issued against them at the International Criminal Court by the chief prosecutor for war crimes. If you are going to be in this place, then it's going to have a cost. There is going to be some accountability. You're at least going to have to make a decision as to whether this is your preferred course of action. And in that respect, the decisive leverage, of course, exists on the part of the US, and it was chosen not to deploy this. Quite the opposite. Let's be very clear. Israel could not have continued these operations as they are without the constant conveyor belt of American arms. Categorically. At the very least, Israel would have to have prioritized what it did with the weapons it had. Of course, it wasn't just the arms, it was the diplomatic and political cover. The US doesn't exist in a vacuum. We are in Europe. There has been a conspicuous absence of a European position which also sought to impose costs. If you're not going to pursue either of those, your third option is, do you work with the dynamics inside the society of the warring parties? I'm focusing on Israel because the asymmetry of power is huge, and because the position on the Palestinian Hamas side has been quite consistent and, whisper it, but it's actually closer to the international consensus position. The Hamas position is a full permanent ceasefire, the withdrawal of Israel, return of the Israelis being held in exchange for Palestinian prisoners. This is what Israel, and it seems its backers have rejected. So the third option, and I would say this option also existed, was to look at the dynamics. Where are the tipping points? Those did exist, interestingly enough, at certain key moments. You had an Israeli society divided because the issue of the Israelis being held and not being dealt with, being addressed by their own government, felt like a fundamental break in the social contract. You had leaders of the security establishment who saw that there was a law of diminishing returns here and that Israel was being sucking itself, in effect, into an attritional situation, and that Israel doesn't have an endless flow of reservists. I think alongside the failure to impose costs and consequences, this was maybe even more staggering because it seems that this is what America was trying to lean into. Yet at every crucial moment, the US aligned itself with the Israeli leaders' narrative, including, by the way, this weekend, where yet again, we were told in what is, I've run out of words for it, but certainly in a duplicitous manner, by the outgoing National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, that the problem is still with Hamas. They're the only ones holding up a ceasefire, which is categorically not the case. In that kind of a situation, where does one turn? And at the moment, what we've seen is that there is nowhere to turn that can deliver the results that are absolutely needed. One would have hoped that there might be a coalition of actors that would say, we don't carry a brief for Palestinian-Israeli well-being, but we have some interest in an already fragile global architecture and possibility of adhering to some kind of international law and conventions. We have a shared interest in keeping that in some kind of working order. Because what this war has done with Western backing is taken an ice pick, taken a hammer to the idea that the West can speak with any credibility about international law, international norms, a rules-based order, the international court system, and can carry that message to others. Apparently, that was not enough. So you have seen some global South actors try to step into that breach. South Africa at the ICJ with the genocide case. The 50-odd countries who made submissions in another ICJ advisory opinion ruling. The votes at the UN, which can only progress at the General Assembly because the Security Council on this issue is broken by the US. And then one has seen popular mobilization to try and impose costs on politicians. Even in the US, there was the attempt until the last minute to say, you will pay a cost, Democrat leaders, if you are indifferent to the will of your constituency on this issue. Not the only reason they lost the election. That has still not played out. And I would close by saying, one of the problems I would argue is on this issue, there is a tendency in the US, in Europe, to adhere to not only political, military, financial support for Israel, but to support a narrative on the Israeli side, which bears no resemblance to the reality that anyone following this sees with their own eyes. And we saw it play out in dramatic ways, again in the last few days, in relating to the events in the streets of Amsterdam. If UEFA, if FIFA, if the global sporting authorities pursued their own previous practices and rules, then first of all, Israel wouldn't be an international sporting footballing competition because there are clubs registered in the Israeli league who are based in the illegal Israeli settlements. That was used against another country to throw it out of international footballing competition. But in a time of genocide and apartheid, there can be no normal sport. And what happened, and the analogies being drawn to Jewish history, is a trivialization and an abuse and an affront to that Jewish history. Racist thugs chanting genocidal songs can be welcomed by European elites and governments, but the people of this continent in their cities and towns are not going to welcome them. And it shouldn't come down to that. And the last thing I would cautiously, no, maybe I'll hold it till later. I should stop here. I'll stop here.
Well, as a European living in the United States, I am afraid I have to agree with much of what you've said, because it's quite striking to see how Europe on this issue has no voice. It is divided, and for reasons that we could discuss, it in effect is completely absent. And that was not always the case in the past. There were times when the Europeans did play a role in pushing for the rights of the Palestinians, for a peace based on UN resolutions, on Resolution 242, for international law. And today, international law is really completely ignored. Now I'm going to turn to Hassan Salameh. Hassan Salameh has he's both a scholar and an activist and a diplomat. He was involved in the negotiation that ended the Lebanese civil war with Lakhdar Brahimi, a great Algerian diplomat. He then worked for the United Nations, for Kofi Annan. He was in Baghdad when many of our colleagues were killed. He played a role advising Kofi Annan on many issues, and he was the envoy of the UN after Kofi Annan in Libya. And that was a time when Libya, which has been more on the downhill recently than an uphill, it was a time when there was some progress being made. And so, Hassan, I think it'd be interesting if you spoke a bit about that experience to give us a bit of hope on how the UN articulated its action also with some NGOs, and maybe later we can speak of other activities you have.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jean-Marie. Is it working?
Yes.
Well, it's very sad if you look at the various conflicts nowadays in the world that you have a deficit of goodwill and mediation efforts almost everywhere. There was a time where mediators were competing with each other to play some role in solving the problems. Nowadays, there is a clear deficit. What Danielle was telling us basically is that the war has been going for 13 months now in Gaza without any serious effort at mediation. Not a single one. The Europeans, as you said, Jean-Marie, although they are the bankers of the Palestinian Authority, although they are the bankers of the peace process, or have been the bankers of the, have no say on the political side. The Arab countries sometimes help this or that party, but they are certainly not in a mediating effort. And when it comes to the United States, it is the only country acceptable to Israel to mediate. But it is not mediating. It is supporting what Israel is doing every day. And therefore, this is a conflict where now more than 45,000 people have been killed, and I don't see anybody mediating. Certainly not the UN. Quite to the contrary, the minute the Secretary General uttered a few words about the conflict, not only he suffered from the Israeli government, but also all the agencies suffered the retribution of the government. All the humanitarian agencies, depending on the UN, suffered the retribution for these words uttered by the Secretary General. So this is a conflict that is evolving before our eyes with tens of thousands of victims and not a single mediation taking place. Basically, the American position has been, with Bibi Netanyahu, is like a father with his son. He keeps complaining that his son is not listening to him. And people ask him, what do you do in order to chastise him? And the father answers, I keep increasing his pocket money. That's what I do. And that's what's happening. So this is not mediation. Ukraine, I cannot talk. I mean, there is no mediation really. There has been mediation on very specific points, the wheat, with the help of the Turks and others. But in general, this is also a conflict with no serious mediation taking place. And in fact, to a large extent, the idea of mediation has been put aside for a long while on the crux of the matter, although this is very much the role of the UN to play that role. So we have been adjusting slowly to a situation where the UN has been pushed into looking for important things like climate change, like gender parity, like the situation in Africa, important issues, but where basically the basic function of the organization is somehow marginalized, and that is peace and security. It's a pity because it means that the Secretary General is not helped by the big powers whenever he takes a stand. It's a pity because also the Security Council is paralyzed either because one belligerent refuses to talk to him or because some belligerents are holding their veto power in order to compel the Security Council to remain on the side. So it's really a good thing that the agencies can still operate while the peace and security mechanisms of the organization are to a large extent sort of now marginalized or in operation. So it is left to the man on the ground to try and do things. And you wanted me to say a word about Libya. That's what I did in Libya. I spent there 2 years and a half. My first challenge was to bring the mission back to Libya. When I went to Libya, I discovered that the mission was living in Tunisia. There is no credibility for a mission trying to work with a country or on a country while the inhabitants of the country live in that country and you live elsewhere. This was the basic issue. The second, this is a country where a mediator is necessarily not a postman. If you try to just take one message from the one actor to the other, one player to the other, you do basically nothing. You need to come with ideas. One of the most strange ideas I had to come with is that the exchange rate and the question of financial reform, I related them to the ceasefire whenever there was a ceasefire. I would not help the government unless he does. So it was a balance of power with the government in order to extract economic reforms he was not ready to make otherwise, because he was looking for me in order to help with the ceasefire, but I wanted in return that. And then a mediator needs to be flexible. I went to Libya with the idea that I need to sort of extract a national will out of a very atomized country. That's why I worked immediately for a national conference, bringing together most of the cities and collective groups in that country. But at one point, one player invaded the capital or tried to invade the capital. So you had to change entirely your strategy. And I went from a solution that was based on domestic national conference into one that was based on bringing together the main interferers in the conflict. But I would end with one observation, and that is we have two pitfalls we need to avoid. And I'm not sure I didn't fall in any one of them. The first one is that you have previous experiences. And when you have previous experiences, you try to duplicate them into your new posting. And this is very dangerous. In fact, the sui generis nature of each conflict needs to be taken into consideration. And the second is that the easiest thing to discover is the number and the identity of foreign interferers in any conflict. But this does not mean that you do not need to be very familiar with the domestic dynamics, because at the end, that's where a war starts or ends. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, we have had pretty bleak assessments of what the situation is, and I try to grasp a branch. I think that when we work sometimes with sub-regional organizations, not, as you said, every situation is unique, but the international system is more or less broken today, but there are places where it is more broken than others. And I was tempted to ask Maria Fernanda, coming from Latin America, where the Latin Americans have, I mean, you referred to the Colombia peace process, where time and again they have sometimes taken initiative. Do you see some hope there? I mean, at the moment we have another tragic situation, which is Haiti, where it raises another dimension of mediation, because there it's about negotiation with gangs. And negotiating with gangs is something very different from negotiating with organizations that have a political agenda. It's a different dynamic. That doesn't mean that one doesn't necessarily negotiate with them, but the approach has been different. So can you give us some hope on, from your part of the world?
Hope. Hope in Latin America, that's a tough one, I think. And of course, I think the eyes... yeah, I would say the eyes of the international community always, bring the two well-known conflicts, the Middle East and Ukraine, and it so happens that we have more than 100 active conflicts around the world. And of course, everything is context-specific and requires context-specific responses. But I think that we are living a fractured world in a way. And my concern is that prevention and mediation and diplomacy have been replaced by the by default response, which is violence and war, basically. And that is not only the case of Haiti. Very sadly, I have to say, I come from the most unequal region in the world, together with Sub-Saharan Africa, that's Latin America, and the most violent region. If you look at the killings and the deaths, and because of transnational organized crime and drug trafficking, I mean, this is a pain that the region has to bear, and has been unable to respond in a unified, monolithic way from a regional stand. It's, everybody by itself, every country individually trying to address this very difficult situation. And I would say that regional responses are important, and you would tell me immediately, how about the Middle East? What is the regional response there, when we have heard loud and clear what the problems are? And I would say, once again, the issue of prevention is critical. And in countries like my own country, Ecuador, but in highly unequal parts of the world, the prevention agenda, it's called the Sustainable Development Goals Agenda, it's called Agenda 2030, and you were saying, and rightly so, the UN is so worried and invested in climate change and the Sustainable Development Goals and the Development Agenda, and how about the peace and security, a core mandate of the UN, and I think that the UN itself has to rethink its peace and security architecture. I see a lot of good in the new Agenda for Peace, which is very much centered around prevention. I know that we are discussing mediation here, and you have put an example that is perhaps, the example of the new forms of violence and conflict in Haiti. It is not a civil war type, or interstate type of war. It is a war between the people of Haiti and organized crime and the gangs that have other connections in terms of deals with weapons and drugs. Everything comes together. And I think the challenges, are huge. And again, as a multilateralist, I would say of the things we heard, and I think we would all agree. First of all, I think that we need to acknowledge the mediation efforts of Qatar and Egypt and countries that really tried hard and were unable to go further in this case. But I was going to say 3 headlines of what I heard and learned here. It's number one, the importance of international law being universal, and the big challenge of international law, because of the reasons that were shared here, is the issue of accountability and enforceability. I think that we have not come to grips to what it means, the breach of international law. Not for some, not for one or two, but for everybody, to abide by international law. And this is an unresolved issue of the multilateral architecture that we should look at carefully. The number two is the balance of power between the different bodies of the United Nations. And by that I mean the power relationship between the UN Security Council and the General Assembly. More and more we see the General Assembly, taking a greater and most prominent role in peace and security because of the Uniting for Peace resolution of 1950, but also the most recent resolution, the Liechtenstein resolution on the veto. On the veto from the Security Council and explanations to the General Assembly. When we discuss the revitalization of the General Assembly, I think we should consider a more prominent role of the General Assembly in peace and security issues. And of course, in the making, a long process, more a marathon than a sprint, the reform of the Security Council. And these are mandates that are now embedded in the Pact of the Future. And when we say reform of the Security Council, people immediately say, how many more permanent seats? Who is going to be in? Who is going to represent Africa? But if you don't change dramatically the working methods of the Security Council, regardless of how many more permanent members are going to be part of the Security Council, the main flaws and challenges of the Security Council are not going to be addressed. I'm a big believer that, the silver bullet there, in a way, is the working methods of the Security Council, the accountability of the Security Council, and it's the main role, the original role for which it was created. So, in the third point I wanted to make, it's related to the North-South clash and divide. Because of double standards, because of a trust deficit, because the system is not working for the countries of the global majority in a way. And you have provided many examples of what is the origin of the mistrust? When countries in the global majority feel that the system, and I mean the multilateral system, is not delivering we need to rethink the ways we take decisions on how to govern our global commons. And I would say these, of course, go beyond a little bit of the discussion we are seeing here, but I think we need to look at this in a more systemic, organic way. And as a UN nerd, as a multilateralist, I feel the need to address these issues. And if you want, we can go more into the detail.
I think we don't have time, sadly.
Well, but and sorry about going on and on and on about that. But even bilaterally, I know very well the case of Haiti. We were present as Ecuador with our own troops there at a point in time, and there's a lot to discuss about that. The lack of solidarity on the Haiti case.
Thank you very much. I wish, 45 minutes is too short for a topic like the one we are discussing. And I'd like to give the floor back to Danielle and to Hassan. To Danielle to tell us what can be done in the present circumstances. Hassan, maybe, you spoke a bit about prevention. We spoke a lot about prevention, but you told me about your efforts, for instance, in Lebanon, which in a way show that it's not mediation, but it's a way to try to salvage peace. And so maybe we should end on, maybe you can say a word on that to end on a more, if not positive note, on a note of hope. Danielle, and I'm sorry that we won't be able to take questions, but you can, the speakers are there, and so we can continue a bit the conversation informally afterwards.
Look, very briefly, the first bit, it doesn't get any easier. I think if I look just at what I was talking about previously on the Middle East, we see other things. We see the weapon systems that are being used, that are being tested on Palestinians. The use of AI, robotics, automated weaponry. If people have heard about the Lavender system for mass targeting, that's only going to get worse. We see the impunity going to a place where schools, hospitals become targets. I'm sure it didn't need what Israel's doing in Gaza for hospitals to be targeted in Sudan, but there you have it. That's what's happening. There are things that aren't related to that conflict that I've been talking about, or not primarily, that are only going to make this more difficult. The proliferation of actors, also in a place like Sudan, with resources to do harm. It's the beginning of the COP29. Climate crisis, mass displacement. The struggle for resources is only going to make this worse. But I'll end with this. You talked, Jean-Marie, about solutions from within the region. There are some interesting things happening. It's interesting that Iran and Saudi, you had the Saudi chief of staff in Iran just now to try and prevent the proliferation. It doesn't apply to the bigger conflict for all the reasons I listed earlier, but in the absence of that, it comes down to balance of forces on the battlefield. It comes down to how much destructive capacity you have. By the way, I would argue Israel is generating real vulnerabilities for itself. It doesn't have total escalation dominance, would be my argument. And my last comment is, if I were to look for one glint of a possibility in the incoming US administration, it's whether it would be easier for a Trump administration to lean into some kind of acknowledgement and what do we do with multipolarity. That might be their Nixon to China than it was for Democrats who were very insistent on reasserting American primacy and unipolarity. And when all of that doesn't work, people can fill that gap still. The sporting authorities, when it came to South Africa, only instituted the rugby boycott because rugby couldn't continue normally because the people wouldn't let it happen. The actions that have taken place in the court system create lots of opportunities. What the ICJ ruled creates lots of opportunities for citizens, for companies to go to their own court systems and say, we are complicit in an international crime, our court system has to rule on this weapons sale, etc. And consumers. There are consumers in significant parts of the world, in the Middle East, in parts of Asia, who've stopped buying certain products because of what's going on. And you always have that ability.
Thank you. Hassan.
Well, I think there is 1 minute left, and I will have only one idea. And the idea has to do with our adjustment to something that is abnormal. What I fear most these days is the fact that we are adjusting and accepting the idea that 45,000 people are killed with no accountability in view, that international humanitarian law is being violated without nobody really protesting against it, that the International Criminal Court prosecutor is intimidated and nobody rushes to defend him, that basically a lot of UN resolutions are adopted but then put on the shelf, that you cannot produce new UN resolution and it doesn't worry anybody. I am afraid that we are slowly adjusting to the new rules of the world as it is, which is a world based on the balance of power and the indiscriminate use of force in order to settle the issues the way you want. One could hope that it could have hoped that it is a Russian exception, but it appears there is also an Israeli exception and a Russian exception. Soon we may have other exceptions going around the world. Of people.
Sudan.
Sudan, of course. Sudan, of course. So we are at a phase in human history where we should ask ourselves if we are not adjusting silently, consciously or unconsciously, to the idea that human life is not that central, that impunity is something we have to live with, and that international law is there only to be taught but not to be implemented.
Thank you. Well, we are here in the place where the Declaration of Human Rights was agreed, and so I think it should serve us as a kind of compass that we should not lose sight of a certain direction that we took for a number of decades, and now we are in the fog of war, and we must not lose our beacon, and our beacon is just peace, and we are further and further away at the moment from it. Thank you. Thank you to the panel.